control the churches, and you control the world. The godless left understands this. The question is, do Christians? I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight. Politics cannot be abandoned to the enemy without surrendering Christ's lordship. A few generations ago, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Christian who disagreed with R.J. Rushdoony's assessment. Yet today, we're often told that Christians should never vote or hold elected office because it's worldly. Yet the people who founded this nation would have said that only Christians can be trusted in office. Who's right? For the answer, we turn to Megan Basham, the New York Times bestselling author of Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Megan, welcome to Restoration Spotlight.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Our pleasure. Let's start with the true meaning of separation of church and state. And to many, including many Christians, that basically means secularism. You know, this supposedly neutral position between competing faiths, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, we could go on. Now, I would just point out that secularism isn't neutral at all. It's just as much a contender here as any church. Now, Megan, what do you think the Founding Fathers had in mind when it comes to the role of the church in our government and in our lives?
Well, I think the answer there is pretty simple. They didn't want an established church, but in no way was that suggesting that Christians and people of faith shouldn't be living out their values as it applies to our civic life. So, of course, we are to avail ourselves of all of those wonderful constitutional remedies that the secularists also avail themselves of, the free association, free speech, electing leaders who are going to reflect our values, promoting constitutional amendments that we think align with our morality. So all of those things. And, it's funny because we're having these huge debates about the separation of church and state now, but I will be another one of those people who points out that was just in a letter from Thomas Jefferson. It's not actually in our founding documents. So, for me, it's very simple. We don't have an established state, but we do have a very Christian founding. And I'll even go further and say we have a very Protestant founding.
Yes, I completely agree with you. Yes. It's interesting, though, sticking with that point, I do think people's minds are being changed about this all of the time. One of the great phrases of the American Revolution is "no king but Jesus." And yet, as far as I know, for the last two and a half centuries, the only president who's called Jesus king is Donald Trump. Probably the last one you'd ever expect, not Calvin Coolidge, not any of the others. You have all these Christians who cite the Bible as a reason why they should not be involved in grubby politics, and it is grubby, right? Or at least not count a vote for Trump. What's your response to that?
Well, it's funny. I actually wrote an essay this week. So I spent about 1,400 words diving into this question of Trump and our Christian witness and politics. And one of the things I looked at was, yes, we saw this just this past weekend at Charlie Kirk's memorial, an outpouring of honoring from our federal officials for not just a generic, vague God, which is pretty common from, a lot of our elected leaders, but very specific honoring of Jesus Christ, even from, those members of the presidential cabinet who are not Christians. I think Tulsi Gabbard is a Hindu, and even she was sort of joining this honoring of the name of Christ. And so that was really interesting to me. And so, when I was delving into this essay, I went back and looked, okay, what did some of our most prominent evangelical leaders say back in 2016 about how our Christian witness was going to intersect with our conservative politics when it came to someone like Trump. And, I found an article in the Washington Post from Russell Moore, who is now the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Of course, at that time, he was the head of the political lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. And at that time, he said that he believed that Donald Trump would be the ultimate destruction of the religious right. So
what
essentially, Moore was arguing that we had so compromised our witness, evangelicals, with their support of Donald Trump, that the next generation would be very turned off and they were going to become more secular, even on the right, because of Donald Trump. And I followed that up looking at a blueprint, one of the last major works that Tim Keller wrote, theologian Tim Keller in the PCA, about how we might bring about revival in the U.S. And in that, Keller said that he thought it would take sort of a partnership across the political spectrum, but he put Trump supporters outside the bounds of those he believed would be helpful for bringing about a revival. Then we see what happened at this memorial. And so, my contention was they were simply wrong. That in fact, the Christians like a Charlie Kirk who said, I am going to support Donald Trump, even though, I have issues with his, personal background or his personality. His policies most align with the policies that I believe are backed by biblical morality. And therefore, I'm going to strongly advocate not just for those policies, but also for him as a candidate, because I think he's better than the alternative. So when we look at that, we can see today that I don't think those predictions from Keller and Moore were correct. And in fact, the Charlie Kirk model seems to have been pretty effective, because I don't know about you, but not only was I hearing this, honoring of Jesus Christ from these officials, some of whom I think are probably Bible-believing Christians and some who aren't, but also I saw an outpouring of interest from maybe political moderates or conservatives saying, wow, that memorial was something, or Charlie Kirk's legacy. I'm now looking at it and I'm looking at the things he said. And what I feel is this interest in Christianity like I've never had before. Like I had an atheist friend said that. I saw some Muslims that I know saying, wow, that was really something. I'm going to go check out a Christian church. I'm curious about it. So all I can say at the end of that is that I actually think that someone like Charlie Kirk giving unapologetic voice to his convictions in the political realm, while also talking about how they come out of his strong Christian faith, has been incredibly persuasive to the next generation. And we see that statistically when we see all these young men saying they're going back to church, for example.
Well, he lived and he died as a Christian, and it's always Christian behavior that turns heads. Going all the way back to ancient Rome, this has always been true. Going back to the Big Eva thing, of course, Tim Keller's gone to the Lord now, but has Russell Moore apologized? Has he changed his mind? Any of the Big Eva leaders who are viciously never Trump?
No. I mean, I think he's pretty entrenched in that. I haven't seen any wavering from that position from him. One thing that is an interesting development that I think, you did some great work on this. I picked up on your work a little bit in my book, Shepherds for Sale, and I did give
you
credit.
Flatter me.
Hayden, I gave you credit.
You certainly did. You didn't need to.
That the lobbying arm that Russell Moore led, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the SBC, recently announced that they are cutting ties with the Evangelical immigration table. And while they didn't specifically say this was why, there had been a lot of outcry from rank and file Southern Baptists over its partnership with the secular National Immigration Forum and the funding that was coming into that organization from people like George Soros and other secular leftists who were trying to promote amnesty policies or more lax border policies. And so it was interesting to me to see, while Russell Moore has not shifted his position, we are seeing some of the institutions that he was previously involved with shifting positions. And, just one more note on that. After they initially put out a obituary for Charlie Kirk at Christianity Today that emphasized his work as a political activist. In fact, their headline said an activist for the MAGA doctrine. Since then, I've seen them put out a number of essays that do a much better job of reflecting on Charlie Kirk's faith and his Christian witness and the evangelistic part of TPUSA and TPUSA faith. So, I think that without coming out and saying, hey, we maybe got that wrong initially, it has at least been a course correction over the course of the last 2 weeks.
So, Megan, a lot of your work centers on exposing this rift you didn't create. You're simply reporting on it and showing people between regular, everyday parishioners and evangelicals and the cosmopolitan citizen of the world, increasingly, unfortunately, influenced by the progressive left leadership we call Big Eva, big evangelicalism. I'm thinking of people like Andy Stanley and David French, right, who have compromised with the left on things like COVID lockdowns, what they call side B homosexuality, acceptance of same-sex identifying pastors, social justice ideas, racism, white supremacy, these ideas that we really find are left-wing coded, that they have become ambassadors for the conservative church. Am I exaggerating the problem here when I say that that is a massive difference between what's being preached from a lot of these influential, mostly megachurch evangelicals and tangential to that, and then the people who are everyday Bible believers attending these churches?
No, I mean, if anything, I would say that was a rather soft way of putting it. In some of these cases, you mentioned David French, and he has openly said that as a matter of law, he has evolved on gay marriage, so he would no longer oppose it. As he would now be someone who's in support of Obergefell. Now, he will say, as a Christian.
Wow.
He still morally opposes gay marriage, but he thinks it would be too destructive to dismantle, I believe what he wrote was these joyful gay families. So, a very obvious shift in position there. And if you look at someone like Andy Stanley, he has not openly come out and said, I am now LGBTQ affirming. But as I wrote in the book, I had talked to a number of pastors who were in private meetings with him who said that, yes, he said he does believe that the best thing now is, rather than opposing homosexuality as a sin, would be to tell gay people, we'll get married and be monogamous at least. So, that's a very different shift. And I spent a lot of time detailing the fact that, he has leaders on staff at his church who are very much LGBTQ affirming now. So, that is no longer a bar to serving in his church. And in fact, they have materials, they promoted curriculum. The name is escaping me right now of the curriculum that they sponsored and helped distribute. But it was very much LGBTQ affirming curriculum that was supposed to come alongside and help parents, Christian parents, say, if you have a gay child or a transgender child, how do you respond to that? And this book was basically, you affirm it. You welcome them and not just show love to them, but you tell them that this is a good way that they are made and that God embraces how they were made. So, something very anti-biblical. And even in this moment where we all talk about the vibe shift, right? And I think there has been a true vibe shift towards conservative ideology, towards more traditional family values. I really do think we're seeing that. You can see it in polling for the first time. Support for gay marriage has gone down in younger generations.
That's right.
But you're not seeing it from those leaders. So you haven't seen David French shift positions to come back with this vibe shift. You haven't seen
and actually, you've seen the opposite, right? One of the ways you always measure these things, particularly in the church, is what did they say 10 years ago? And what are they saying right now? It's one thing to harden in your views and say, I've changed my mind on a question of doctrine like infant baptism or something like this, where there's a range of legitimate views within traditional Christianity. But to go from, no, in 2016, David French, represent the true conservative Christian and Reformed Christian position on this, and now you're virtually indistinguishable from a very soft leftist on that same issue, whereas you and I are not, we've maintained the same position that we've had, shows that you're going to be different in 10 years from now, and the trajectory is always towards the left.
Yes, absolutely true. And I think that we can see the fallout, even though someone like David French would say, but I still personally believe that Christianity requires us to limit marriage to a man and a woman. When you say, I am willing to negotiate that in the public sphere, you're acknowledging that I am going to back, as a matter of law, something that I know biblically is destructive to my neighbor, and not just destructive to that neighbor who is engaging in homosexual relationships, but also we see the Pandora's box that Obergefell decision opened. It brought us not just the transgender movement, which has been incredibly destructive, but it also brought us this widening traffic in babies through the surrogacy trade.
That's
so
right.
Suddenly we have children who are deliberately being brought into the world who are not going to be primarily raised by their mothers, because you typically see this most frequently for some reason with gay men. And so you have these motherless children and sometimes fatherless children by design. So, it has wreaked destruction upon destruction and deformity upon deformity. And that is why we say you cannot have these issues that are biblical issues on the most fundamental structure in our society, the family, and say it's just a personal matter. And so, when I look at that, I go, what you have chosen isn't just bad theology, it's also bad policy.
You've raised a really important question around IVF and surrogacy. And this is an emerging hot button issue among pro-lifers. The tip of the spear already has a strong position, but most people are looking at it, I think, the way President Trump looks at it, which is, it means more babies. How can that be a bad thing? Give us the case against IVF, or at least for IVF skepticism.
Well, first, from a pro-life position, these are fertilized eggs we're talking about. So these are human beings. So we're talking about the mass destruction of human beings that we brought into existence through our technology. So that's the first thing. I mean, if you're pro-life, I think that has to be beyond bounds. Now, I think I have known some people who pursued what you might call ethical IVF. So, there are pro-life people who said, we are only going to fertilize the same number of eggs that we're going to try to bring to full term.
Interesting.
And so I think that's a different discussion. But if you are fertilizing eggs that you're going to destroy, at that point, you're destroying life. So that's one. And then the second part of that is my friend Katie Faust does such great work on this. She's talked about the mother wounds or the father wounds of these children who are raised without one of their parents. They want to know their identity. They want to know who they are and where they come from. And, while we can say it's a tragedy when a child has to be raised without their biological mother or father because of death or divorce, it's not ideal. We don't want that. But when we are deliberately creating children in order to raise them without their mother or father, you are deliberately then creating those mother-father wounds. So you're creating a lifelong trauma for an individual who is now never possibly going to know where they came from. They're never going to have that relationship with a parent that they very much need and very much want.
Very powerfully said. Related to this whole idea is the much older idea of population control. It's controlling both the number of people created, but also the ones who are not created. But by extension, eugenics, what they look like. It's the numbers and the quality of the people born. Now, I understand you're working on a book right now that ties feminism from the last 100 years or so into the population control movement. Will you tell us about that?
Yeah. And, I'm very much in the early stages of working on this book. What I was looking at was the fact that when we look at women today, we see that they are achieving career heights and academic heights that we never could have expected in past generation. Women, I think, are now dominating in the managerial class. They're dominating in academia. In many large metropolitan cities, young women are actually out earning young men. And yet we've also never seen women so unhappy. So, for the first time ever, women's unhappiness surpassed men's unhappiness levels. And we're also seeing women having skyrocketing rates of depression, of alcohol abuse, of suicidal ideation, of anti-anxiety medication needs, things like this. And so I started looking at, okay, why is that happening? And one of the things we can see is that the things that tend to make women happiest, and this is by research, this isn't just my opinion, things like marriage and family are the very things they're foregoing. And partly by looking at your work and digging back into some of what the Rockefeller Foundation was working on and the partnership that they had with the Nixon administration, we can go back and see there was actually a point in time where there was a very deliberate effort from these massive secular NGOs and governments in the Western world to divorce women from having the desire for marriage and family, and instead to try to traffic their interests and make them flow into career and professional achievement. And so, for women, we think, okay, this is just about feminism, it's about girl power, when really, for those powers that you're talking about, it was about reducing the population. It was about the fact that we want them to have fewer babies. And part of my research into that, which is kind of going in the weeds since I haven't written it out yet. But it was really interesting to me to find, even today, some of these Christian organizations who are there supposedly serving in third world nations and impoverished countries in order to, bring them food, to spread the gospel. In fact, what they've done in partnering with some of these huge foundations, and at the time also USAID, which is defunct now,
and the United Nations, yes,
birth control. Yes. And to bring it was really interesting to me to find that one of the things that World Relief, for example, has been doing with one of those massive USAID grants was to counsel women in a third world nation. I think Syria was one of them. Not just how to get birth control, but to convince them that they want birth control. So there was a very, broad curriculum on how do we get the faith leaders in these communities to show women that they may want to have fewer children.
You go back to the 1960s and you have all of this money spent in the name of philanthropy, loving your fellow man, from the Rockefeller and these other big Carnegie foundations that could pour through these advocacy groups like the Population Council, created in the 1950s to control a number of Indians and Africans and Asians. And the saddest story I've ever read, and I've found almost nobody who's aware of it, in the 1960s, India was ground zero for these population control efforts. They tried everything because it had a socialist government that agreed there are too many of our people here. And you had what they developed called the vasectomy belt, all the way running through northern India. And it was provinces where police would line up, deny you jobs if you didn't get a vasectomy or have your tubes tied as a woman. And they would actually form these lines of men and women where they would beat you, threaten to shoot you if you didn't comply and go into the doctor to be snipped and taken care of and all of that, all done by force. And this is a socialist country where the only way to get a job, get food, is to work for the government, and the government can withhold these things, and did. We funded all of that. The Johnson administration withheld from USAID all of this foreign aid and food going to India, specifically saying you need to get your population under control and then we'll feed you. So we've been funding this. That's Christian tax dollars in a supposedly Christian country doing this. And people need to realize, I'm rambling, but people need to realize that our fellow evangelicals who don't think that birth control and contraception are related to abortion, realizing that term birth control was developed by Margaret Sanger as a way to market what became the abortion industry over 100 years ago. And it's always been the case that controlling the number of children that these people have in these poor developing countries where they live on $1 a day always goes with the same talking point. We're educating women. We're teaching women. Who can it be opposed to teaching women about birth control, about contraception, about all of these things ending in abortion? Always.
And what's fascinating is when you see some of the documents that they produced coming out of, some of these think tanks back in the 50s and 60s, as you referenced, they had some pretty radical ideas that they did not end up employing in the United States. But as you said, they did employ in other nations. So, there were people within these think tanks saying, well, what if we just require women to get jobs? What if that's mandated? What if we have forced sterilization on American women? Now,
Wow.
You had cooler heads who didn't necessarily disagree with the position. They just knew they couldn't sell it to the public. So they went, that's too far. Let's not go with that because, people will rightfully reject that and there will be a backlash. So they didn't pursue that here, but it was still an underlying ideology that they supported and promoted. And they, as you said, they just exported it to other nations. So, for me, the interesting part is that it always does come back to that, let's have fewer people. So there's a very anti-humanity stance with that entire movement. And again, we think of it as just feminism or, freeing women from the obligations of home and family, when really it was very much, we don't want you to be having so many babies.
So, the church has been fairly consistently against abortion, to their credit. It's one of the few things we've been pretty good at over the last 100 years. But feminism still crept in. And I do think there's a direct connection to going back to the suffragettes to what is now the radical socialist third wave that we're hopefully living through the last years of. But does that have a bearing on the work that you've done about the general left-wing infiltration of the church? Big money, big corrosive leadership, et cetera. Do you see a tie between, those two things over the last century or so?
Yes, I do. And part of that is because when you see that sort of liberalizing force come into the church, when you get to, say, a pride flag on your church, it very often flows downstream of feminism. Now, I won't say that this has happened in every denomination, but nearly every denomination where they have become, say, LGBTQ affirming, it started with a feminist stance. They are almost always, they began by saying, okay, we didn't used to ordain women because there are passages in scripture that say the pastorate is reserved for men. And eventually they threw that out. So once you've thrown out the male and female distinctions about roles, it's a whole lot easier to throw out distinctions about sexuality and gender generally. And so I do think that, in most cases, Assemblies of God is maybe the only,
Yeah.
That I can think of where that hasn't been the trajectory.
There's a few exceptions, but not many.
Right,
Not
a
many.
few exceptions, but not many. In most cases, it begins with this capitulation to the feminism issue. And then I think once you have made that capitulation, it's much easier to compromise on other issues. And I don't always think, when you're talking to these pastors or these ministry leaders, they're not necessarily thinking about it. I think they just sort of live and move in this feminist landscape and atmosphere. It's like the fish in water. They don't even realize how much feminist ideology is shaping how they approach ministry. I have seen, and I'm a Southern Baptist, it's a very conservative denomination for the most part, with the exception of some leadership. But at the same time, they will say, what do we do to get more women into leadership roles? And my question is, why is that a goal that you have? I mean, women are incredibly influential as mothers, as wives, serving in various ministries. Why are you, for example, looking at your boards and saying, well, we need more women here? And so, it's this, it is a social justice assumption that if we don't have enough women serving in this particular capacity, then there's something wrong with our board. And, I would interrogate that impulse. I think that they don't realize that they're doing it in some cases. I have a friend who calls it the progressive gaze, Gaze, in that these pastors, when they think about how they should evangelize, when they think about how they do ministry, they don't realize that they're thinking about it with this little progressive on their shoulder and how this progressive will respond to their ministry decisions. And I think that's such a good illustration, because when you talk about feminism in the church, I think that's where a lot of where it's coming from. So, in some cases, I think you have people who are deliberately bringing in bad ideology, bad doctrine, but far more often, I think you just have pastors and ministry leaders who are swimming in those progressive waters with the little progressive on their shoulder. And so they're trying to think, well, how do we take our church culture, our Christian culture, and make it less offensive to the secular culture? And one of the first ways you do that is through that sort of soft wave feminism.
Yeah, I like to think of it, that is a great illustration. I like to think of it as we're coded to think within left-wing terms. We're bound on either side. And so for many conservatives, you are functionally on the right of the left. You're not truly outside of the framework of how the left thinks about all of this stuff. And one of the aspects of the Great Awakening we're going through right now, if I can call it that, is decoding all of these social justice or Marxist light impulses that are there. And I wonder too, maybe you know the answer to this, it seems to me that a lot of the capture of the churches began as a capture of the seminaries. I mean, beginning in the 19th century, when you see long before any of the feminism or the LGBT stuff, you see the emergence of German liberalism critiquing historic doctrines that Catholics and Protestants have always believed. That being imported, I know in Reformed circles, of which I'm part, our churches started to go bad when we started to import Germans. I mean, really, it was kind of that simple, because we were importing people who were learning more about Hegel and Marx and Engels than they were about historic scripture and John Calvin and Martin Luther and so on. What do you think about that?
Yes, and I think you can see that same trajectory when you go back to the 90s and you look at the racial reconciliation push. Now, on the one hand, that comes from a really good impulse that we don't want to be separated by our ethnicity or by our cultural backgrounds, because there is neither Jew nor Greek. But what that did, I think, was it created in a lot of seminaries a push to say, okay, we need to have more professors, we need to have more curriculum that is coming from minorities of one sort or another. And there was not so much interest in how biblical and how doctrinally sound is some of this material that we're bringing in from various minority theologians or pastors or preachers. And so you did get a lot of that James Cone Black liberation theology coming in, which is very Marxist in nature. And so, I think that is part of why, when I particularly look at Southern Baptist seminaries, which I tended to look at a lot because I am one, but also because they educate a plurality of Protestant pastors and ministry leaders in all denominations. When you look at what happened with them, that was a big part of it. The CRT scare didn't really start to happen until 2019, I think. But if you go back and look much further, the bringing in of Black liberation theology, the James Cone, the Delgado and Stefanik and those type of things, they didn't come in until there was that big push for racial reconciliation. And so it's really hard to separate out the good impulse with a lot of the bad doctrine that it brought in. And so, I look at somebody like Vodi Bakum and I go, thank God for him, because he was somebody who, was in a position as a Black man to say, hold up, this doctrine is not okay. And unfortunately, and that's just human nature, that everybody went, well, we're going to hear it from Vodi because Vodi is himself Black. And so, we're not afraid of him offending people when he says it, but it made people uncomfortable to confront it because you don't want to be painted as a racist. And you certainly don't want to suggest that we don't want to, learn from great Black theologians or great Hispanic theologians. But again, I think that rush to representation that you're talking about brought in that bad doctrine.
Vodi's not afraid of anything. I'm utterly convinced of that.
Not.
He's fearless. So that, I agree with you. A lot of this is a long, very difficult to sort out kind of dissemination down, into the churches, and you can't easily find the strains. But we do know from your work, we do know that there is some level of deliberate manipulation, So I'm thinking, of course, of big money from Soros and everything. Let's talk about the J29 Coalition. So this is an organization that you've recently exposed as of recording here. They say, and I'm quoting here, they want to recapture the evangelical political imagination. And yet, we know from your work, they're funded by the left. Is that a disconnect there?
Yeah, I think it is. And not just the left, but from the secular left, in this case, an atheist group. So they're funded by a large secular atheist organization saying that, we want to help preserve democracy. And of course, in their minds, preserving democracy always means somehow getting Christians to vote for the left, to vote for Democrats.
Ruled by Democrats, yes.
Right. And that was the thrust of this J29 curriculum. If you hear their founder, Caleb Campbell, talk about it, he's very much on this Christian nationalism is a threat because it's Christians wanting political power. And as I sit there, I go, well, yes, there's an assumption there that Christians wanting political power is a negative thing. Now, idolizing political power is a negative thing, but the scriptures I read say that it is good when we have just leaders, and it is good when we have just policies. So, all politics is about leveraging some form of power. It's trying to enact your policies over someone else's policies that you think are detrimental or destructive. And so, when you get these groups who are taking that money and they're coming into churches, the other thing you're getting is pastors who I would say are setting aside their responsibility to educate their people on what scripture says about various policy issues, because it has a lot to say on anything from abortion to gender ideology to private property rights. I mean, I would even say to issues like, what should our border policies be? Those are debatable issues, but I think they're legitimate to debate. And yet, instead, what you get are these secular left foundations funneling money in to always promote a progressive stance. And it's always one that is going to do things like break down borders or bring in, authoritarian climate change legislation. So, they're never funneling money into just passing out Bibles or, feeding the hungry or
well, that's boring. Come on, we've done that.
It's never things like that. It's always things about how are we going to change Christians' minds on policy.
Well, I do think you've put your thumb right on the dividing line right there, about the question of what should Christians actually ever have and then exercise political power. And I mean, my gosh, we could look at the entire 20th century as an experiment in the first time in all of the West's history of, here you have 100 years of us trying anti-Christians holding all the political power. How did that go? I mean, it didn't go great. But you do see this resurgence of exactly what you're talking about on the right, of realizing, it's not that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. It's really that only Christians can be trusted to be involved in politics, because if you have any kind of biblical understanding of human nature and the sin that just dominates our hearts, Why would you ever trust somebody who can't at least say, I've been forgiven by my God, and I know what the 10 Commandments are, and I'm going to do my best to pass just laws in accordance with that?
Yes. And I think, Hayden, when you sit and look at these kind of organizations, J29, another one I covered was the After Party. I mean, you covered the Evangelical Environmental Network, the Evangelical Immigration Table. When you look at what these organizations are doing, it makes sense that they're trying to target Christians. One, because evangelicals are such a massive, important voting bloc, right? I mean, I think, they're anywhere, depending on how you define evangelical, from like 20 to 30% of the electorate. So they wield a massive amount of influence and power politically in that sense. But also, they're a fairly captive audience, because where else do you have a group of people who go somewhere every week to say, I want to learn how to best live my life and order my society? I mean, most people don't do that in their adult lives if you're not going to church. So it makes sense that you have these secular left organizations going, that's a captive audience that we could reach if we can just find ways to partner with these sort of evangelical ministry front organizations. And so that's why they do that. They want to capture that, what the Atlantic called America's most powerful voting bloc. But when I see pastors then taking that money and then partnering with them, and I don't think every single one who takes it is thinking through the fact that, wait, I am giving my influence and the influence of my pulpit over to the Rockefeller Foundation or over to the Clinton Foundation or the Gates Foundation. But that is essentially what they're doing. In fact, with the After Party, which was another one of those political Bible studies that was funded by the Hewlett Foundation and the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, they brought it in and they said, Pastor, if you don't want to take the heat for talking about politics in your church, just let us do it. And if people get upset, then you don't take the heat. You can just say, oh, well, I maybe didn't agree with that, but they said it, not me. So it is really an abdication of shepherding that we're seeing. And that to me is the most alarming thing. So we can get mad about the foundations trying to come in, but what they're doing is crafty and smart and it makes sense. It's the pastoral abdication of responsibility that is more concerning to me, and going, why would you do this? Why would you want to partner on policy issues with people who, in all other respects, are directly opposed to biblical morality? Like if you look at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, you go, these are the people who, in every other respect, are saying, we think we should be able to perform gender transition surgeries and treatments on children. Or if you're partnering with the Hewlett Foundation, we are the second largest private funders of Planned Parenthood in the country. Why would Christian organizations not look askance at those kind of people saying, we want to give you money to talk about certain policies within your church? Why would you assume that what they want is going to align with what God wants?
It is incredible that despite this mountain of money that we're up against, and the fact that there's a vacuum you've just identified, nobody's doing the counter signaling on the conservative side to say, okay, if you're going to partner with somebody on policy, partner with us, not with them for this reason. And yet the left recently suffered this massive setback when the IRS determined that, in fact, churches can now endorse candidates. Now, they haven't been enforcing that rule, but of course, I'm talking about the Johnson Amendment going back to the 1950s. And the way they came about this was not a sea change in how they looked at it so much as clarifying the Johnson Amendment has murky origins, and it was meant to limit other tax-exempt charities, not churches. Because as you and I know, churches helped spark the American Revolution. They're the backbone of a free republic. Far more than the media is, it's the churches because they provide the actual enlightened citizenship here. Now, I think this is going to be one of those powerful consequences coming out of the second Trump administration. Looking forward here and speculating a bit, Megan, what do you think the long-term impact is going to be?
Well, the first thing I would say is I don't necessarily think they should shy away from this, but most of the pastors I know are not rushing to endorse candidates, at least conservative pastors. Of course, we know that we've seen this for a long, long time on the Democratic side of the aisle and in liberal churches. They have never followed the Johnson Amendment. They never felt constrained by that. So it was really only pastors on the right side of the aisle that felt like, oh, well, we need to abide by the Johnson Amendment. And I think that was the Johnson Amendment's design, was to silence those conservative pastors. But what I am seeing is, while they may not come out and endorse candidates, I am seeing a fresh boldness in talking about not just the issues, but in contrasting the two sides. I think, we have just come out of what we might call the third way era, to reference Keller again. I think he sort of popularized this idea that the gospel is neither right nor left. Jesus, we don't follow a donkey or an elephant, we follow Jesus. And to a certain extent, that's true. We agree with that, you can't easily contain scripture or Jesus or the Bible in one side of the political aisle or the other, but it's not because they're morally equivalent. It's because neither one of them, to me, are even nearly conservative enough to align with scripture. I mean, yes. If you look at where Republicans are, the GOP is here, and I think Christians should be way over here. So neither represents us, but it's not because we're in the middle.
That's right.
And so I think we're coming out of an era, and I'm seeing it with a lot of particularly younger pastors, where they feel emboldened to contrast right and left and say, actually, yes, one side does much more strongly align with a biblical worldview, and it's not the Democrats. And I don't know that prior to the last few years, I had ever seen that. I think I had always seen more, let's not really engage in politics. We may talk about, really abortion and sexuality were the only issues I ever really saw churches touch much on the conservative side. We did see them, doing the creation care push and the welcome the stranger push. But now that the Johnson Amendment has been repealed, and we have seen Democrats back things that I think are so undeniably demonic, quite frankly, you do have this fresh boldness from these pastors who are saying, we can no longer pretend like, and in fact, I just heard, if you know who Mike Winger is, he's this great apologist, has a huge following on YouTube, not known as being a political guy. I just heard him say this week on a podcast, I've never talked about politics before, but I don't think you can be a Christian and remain in the Democratic Party, because what they stand for is too opposed to biblical morality. And that was the first time I had heard someone like that make that statement. And so that's the kind of thing that I think is coming out of this repeal of the Johnson Amendment. Not all these pastors, rushing to endorse Trump or something, but really coming out and saying these two sides are not the same. And we as Christians cannot align with this evil.
And not only that, but we also can't bring the Republican Party out of its squishy middleness into true biblical alignment. But also, if we don't get involved, if we're not voters, if we're not signaling what we want, we can't make the Democrat Party ultimately say, yeah, you know what, you're right, Jesus is king. Sorry about all the leftism, guys. That's kind of the goal, isn't it? It's to have a country that, whether you personally accept him or not, Christ is king over all of this, over everybody on the earth, in this country and in every other country. And having political parties and political documents and laws, et cetera, that acknowledge that, that's what the Bible asks us to do. It absolutely is.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that has kind of come out of this repeal of the Johnson Amendment and this rethinking of how Christians engage politics is that suddenly you're realizing that cultural Christianity was good. I want everyone to be truly saved. But in the meantime, it's good to have a culture that understands the sanctity of human life. It's good to have a culture that understands male and female. He created them, even if every single person in that culture is not yet going to heaven. Now, we want that. We continue to evangelize, but I also think having that culturally Christian landscape is part of how you evangelize. If we all understand and we have reference to the same kind of morality, it's a lot easier to have these discussions about eternal things. It's a lot harder when we can't even agree on, can a man become a woman or not? We're now in such an insane place that we don't even have a baseline in some cases to begin that conversation. So, the other thing that I think is just, if you want to talk about love your neighbor, Christian policies are loving to your neighbor.
By definition. I don't know if President Trump is going to heaven or not, but I'm glad he's living like a Christian to the best he can. And he's telling people you should be a Christian. That's such a turnabout from Christianity's evil, it's the problem. That's incredible. But of course, we're not ending there. That's putting us on the right trajectory towards, yes, and you should actually have your heart changed by the Holy Spirit and be a real Christian, not just pretend to be one, not just play one on TV.
Right.
Well, Megan Basham, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was just saying, at that memorial, it was interesting to me to see even Tulsi Gabbard, who is, of course, a Hindu, talking about, and look, I mean, her theology, couldn't have disagreed with it more. I listened to what she said on the stage and I went, no, we don't all have God within us. That's not true.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Some of us do and some of us don't. But I thought it is a good thing to have a nation where even our unbelieving officials are paying honor to Jesus Christ. I sat back and went, that is a good thing. It's a very Old Testament thing, right? You kind of went, there were moments in the Old Testament where you saw unbelieving leaders nevertheless give protection to the nation of Israel, and that blessed that nation.
Yes,
and so when
right.
I see Tulsi Gabbard saying something like that, I go, I know Tulsi Gabbard isn't a Christian. I know that Tulsi Gabbard is a Hindu, but I think it's a good thing for her to pay honor to the God of the universe.
I love it. It's Joshua at the Jordan. Choose ye this day which gods ye will follow, but as for me and my house, we will follow the Lord. Megan Basham, thank you so much for your time. Where can people follow your work?
You can, of course, find me at Daily Wire. I think all of my, if you look me up there, everything is linked, and Shepherds for Sale is available anywhere you buy books. And I mix it up a lot on Twitter, or X, I guess, as it's now called, at Meg Basham.
Well, again, Megan, thank you for your time. Lovely chatting with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Hayden.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com, and until next time, folks, stay vigilant and trust in God.